Hello and welcome back to the Denver Church of Christ online service. It's great to have you with us. For those of you visiting, we want to extend a special welcome to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to log in with us today, and we hope to get to know you better in the future. It is July. It's a new month. Happy 4th of July to all of you. I hope you're able to celebrate with your families, enjoying the weather and great barbecues and just the food and the friendship and the fellowship that these types of holidays occasion for us. It's great to be in the summertime and the kids are home. And I know that I am enjoying having my kids around the house as much as possible. I hope you are as well. But it's also a month for beginning a new series. We just got done talking about the book of Luke for the last 2 months in May and June. And during this year, we are talking about the concept of hope. And we're using every new series to elaborate upon the concept of hope. And the way that we've done that is that we're looking at hope as though it were a story. And every story has certain elements. You have a narrative, you have villains, you have heroes, protagonists, you have what we're going to talk about this month, which is a setting. Every story has its own unique setting. And the setting of hope is the environment of its people. And our environment is very diverse. It's multi-generational and it's multicultural. In some stories, the setting of the story is merely an afterthought. But in the story of hope, the one that we're studying out this year, our setting becomes one of the main protagonists for making hope real and for sustaining its existence. You can't talk about the concept of hope without referencing what God does to its people, both as individuals and as a community. Over and over again, what we see in the biblical narrative is God bringing people together to act against their own selfish natures in order to consider others better than themselves. That behavior is behind the setting of our current story of hope. Now, we have a setting of many people from many backgrounds when you consider the family of believers. All of us trying to live together in humble submission to one another's needs. At least that's the ideal. That is the calling when Christians are living together. In talking about this, it's important to establish an important point, which is described by today's title, which is not just moonlighting. All right, the setting of many stories can sometimes just be superficial moonlighting, just a backdrop to create a mood. Yet the multicultural setting of God's church is not the same. Our setting is integral. Having a multicultural fellowship, a multi-generational fellowship, is not just for show, or at least it shouldn't be just for show. It's crucial to bringing hope to every corner of the globe. The day of Pentecost, which is what we're going to look at today, showed that the first church and the kind of power that there can be from having different kinds of people from all over the world come together to follow, to believe, and to praise Jesus. The concept of moonlighting, which again, that's the title of our sermon, not just moonlighting, but the concept of moonlighting has meanings that are uniquely related for today's purpose. To moonlight, in one sense, is to have a job that's on the side, other than your main form of employment. So you may have a job where you work during the day and then moonlight at nighttime, all right? But moonlighting is also a distinct type of mood or effect created in theater or cinema as a setting, often romantic, so that a scene can be emphasized just by the lighting that takes place in the background. And yet the setting that God engineers in the story of hope becomes something intrinsic to our very understanding of the concept of hope. Now, the reason that we talk about the setting of hope this way is the very reason it takes center stage at the most dramatic moment in the establishment of the first century church. Now, let's give some context here to Acts 1 and especially Acts 2. When we read Acts 2 in the day of Pentecost, we're reading a day that takes place 50 days, pretty much 50 days after the execution and crucifixion of Jesus. Then 3 days after his death, or on the third day after his death, Jesus rises from the dead. And then 1 week before the story that we're about to read, Jesus ascends into heaven. So he spent nearly 40 days teaching the disciples after he rose from the dead, preparing them for what was to come. So in Jerusalem, during this time of Pentecost and during the time of Passover when Jesus was crucified and rose from the dead, the city of Jerusalem becomes this cosmopolitan melting pot of Jews that are coming from all over the world. Let's go ahead and read Acts 2, starting in verse 1. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now, there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment because each one heard their own language being spoken. Utterly amazed, they asked each other, "Aren't these all who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in our own native language? Parthian, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, and the parts of Libya near Cyrene. Visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism. Cretans and Arabs, we hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues." So a little bit of background on this setting that we're reading, because what we see here is that the disciples who are following Jesus, who are now in the city of Jerusalem after Jesus ascends, get up and they start preaching the first gospel message that is recorded in the Bible. And as they do this, these tongues of fire, I don't know what that would have looked like, but these flames come down, sit upon the disciples, and they begin preaching this first gospel message in all of these different languages. Okay, and so the question that is asked is, how is this setting created? Why are there so many different people from all over the world in Jerusalem on this day? Well, it's important to understand a little bit of Jewish history because the Jews had suffered much over the last 400 years since the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. Because after that temple was destroyed, the Babylonians and the Persians came in and they exiled the Jews and they sent them to all over their empires and reinserted them into different cultures. Now, the reason they did this is because the Jews were historically, renownedly rebellious. They often came together to rebel against their overlords and the people that they're supposed to be paying tribute to. And so it was the last straw, and so they exiled all of the Jews to all these different places. They scattered them. It's called the diaspora. And so the Jews are now located all over the world where they never had been located before. So you have Jewish expatriates being inserted into all these foreign cultures. Now, here's what's amazing is that even though the Jews are being surrounded by these foreign cultures, they maintain their own religious beliefs. Their own faithfulness to God is being maintained. So all of these years where they were in their own home country and they kept being given over to idolatry, it took them being exiled before they really took to heart their identity in God. And they became very faithful to God, even though they were spread throughout the world. And what this meant is that they began intermarrying with some of the people they were around, but then also holding to their religious beliefs. So now you have Jews all over the world learning these cultures in which they had been inserted, learning the languages in which they had been inserted. And so you have synagogues and places of Jewish worship all over the world. And yet they all still make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem on the high holidays, like Passover. So you have pilgrims, Jewish expatriates, and non-Jewish proselytes, people who had become converted to the Jewish God, what they call God-fearers, are now making pilgrimage to Jerusalem during Passover. They witness the crucifixion of Jesus. They hear the stories about his resurrection. And then during Pentecost, they see this miraculous event where all of these followers of Jesus, this man who had died and supposedly had been raised from the dead, are now preaching the word. And you're seeing the reflected diversity of what happened during the diaspora in the day of Pentecost. You have people speaking in all these different languages. This is not happenstance. God planned for this. You know, he had this first gospel message being preached in this type of setting for a reason. This isn't just like an occurrence or a coincidence. God set this up for a reason. And this is important. And this is what's important to our message, is that the setting, this diverse setting, is not insignificant. It's in fact very important to the story of hope and to the story of our church. You know, when I asked Megan to marry me, I had this whole, kind of elaborate plan that I enacted. It was in Christmas of, right near Christmas of 1997. And, we had spent our little Christmas, her and I together. I took her to Wisconsin to meet my family. And then I was driving her home so she could spend Christmas with her family. And then I had to go back to Wisconsin to spend the rest of Christmas with my family. And, we hated spending these types of holidays apart. We were only dating. We couldn't wait to be married. And so, I dropped her back off at home. And then I pretended to go back to Wisconsin. But what I really did is I stayed there because I was going to ask her the next day to marry me. And I had this whole plan set up with this grocery store nearby where Megan's mom was going to send her to the grocery store to pick up some things. And then when she walked into the grocery store, our song was playing overhead. And so she walks in and all of a sudden she hears our song, which is a song by this band called The Cure, not a song that would be played in a grocery store. And so that was curious. And then Megan and I have this little whistle that we do when we're in crowds to get one another's attention. Instead of calling out to one another, we just whistle. And that's how we know that we're looking for one another. And so as she's walking through the aisles, thinking about why this song is on, all of a sudden she hears me whistle. And so she's like, what is going on? And so she starts looking down the aisles, and there I am in the middle of an aisle, in a suit and tie, and she immediately knows something's about to happen. And then we go for a walk, and we end up at this bench on her main street in Roanoke, Indiana. This is the hometown she grew up in. 800 people. That's it. And for all of our friendship, we'd known each other since we were 14. I would come to her hometown, and we would end up on this bench sitting and talking for hours. And so I went to that bench and I asked her to be my wife. And we've been married for 23 years now. But me choosing that bench and me asking her to marry me at that bench, that wasn't coincidence. That was a plan, because that bench meant something to me. That was a bench that marked our friendship. It marked hours and hours of conversation that built the intimacy that we had between one another. And it was also symbolic to me of the friendship and the intimacy I wanted to build upon for years to come. See, we choose settings in our stories for reasons. God chose this setting, this setting of Pentecost, for a reason. It's not happenstance. That place meant something to my wife and I. And this place of Pentecost meant something to God. God did not see the diversity of the church as mere moonlighting. It was important to him. As we will soon see, it was integral to the hope of saving the entire world. So the presence of a multi-ethnic and multicultural crowd was purposeful. Though we don't see yet how in the story, we can be sure that God was doing something here with all of this diversity. Now, what we're also going to see is this type of diversity creates all kinds of problems as well. Go ahead and go to Acts chapter 2, and we'll start reading in verse 40. This is after Peter finishes up preaching this gospel message that everyone is listening to. With many other words, he warned them, this is Peter, and he pleaded with them, "Save yourselves from this corrupt generation." Those who accepted his message were baptized, and about 3,000 were added to their number that day. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship and to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe, and many wonders and signs were performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in their temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. Wow. I mean, what an amazing day this day of Pentecost was. What an incredible way to mark the beginning of this first Jesus church. I don't exactly know how many disciples were speaking all these different languages, but it seems like dozens. I mean, it must have been a cacophony of sound. Next week we're gonna compare this day of Pentecost to the story of the Tower of Babel, because the story, the day of Pentecost was the Tower of Babel, that story reimagined. In the story of the Tower of Babel, you have people coming together to praise their own significance, to praise their own accomplishments. And so God says this level of self-aggrandizement is not healthy. And so he confuses their languages, and spreads them throughout the world. Well, on the day of Pentecost, God brings those people back together to proclaim his day of salvation. And all of these languages in this very miraculous, special moment become one. I mean, what a day. Now, all of this diversity, all of this languages, it does present some pretty unique problems as well. We don't exactly know how many of the 3,000 converts of this day, to Jesus were residents of Jerusalem. We just don't know. But let's just say a third of them were people who did not live in Jerusalem. They're just visiting Jerusalem. What we know for sure is that everybody decided to stay in Jerusalem, all right? And that creates several problems. Number one, it creates a housing problem. Where is everybody going to reside? People can't afford to stay in inns for the whole time. It creates a food problem because people brought enough money and food for their visit. They weren't planning on staying longer than that, which creates a money problem. So imagine you were just converted to Jesus. You are a resident of Jerusalem. You're a new follower of Jesus. You're excited. You feel faithful about the future. And you're grateful. You're just grateful for your salvation. But you know that there's 1,000 other people who have been converted to Jesus who are not from Jerusalem. And they don't have housing, they don't have food. And so you decide to open up your home for another family to stay with you. Now, you work during the day, or you have your craft, you're an artisan of some type, and so all day you spend that time selling your produce or selling your craft so that you can make a living for your family. You come home at the end of the day, and now there's two families living together, and the money that you make, you are now using to share a meal with another family. Now, the family that's with you, they in turn, they start selling their personal possessions to help fund the food that your household needs, but it's not going to be enough. So you also have to sell some of your possessions. Now, you both speak Hebrew okay because you were taught the scriptures, but your natural language is Aramaic, and let's say their natural language is Greek. And so there are these three languages being spoken in the home, and you have different cultural expectations. Let's say that your family, living in Jerusalem is really loud. Like that's a part of who you are. But let's say the family that's staying with you, their culture is a little more stoic and they believe in more quiet. And so as in respect to them, you are trying to get your kids and your family to live a little bit more quietly in your home while they are teaching their kids to be a little bit more tolerant of the noise that your family makes, okay? Now, you both have kids, and your kids get into fights, and so you're having to come together as families to work out these issues, as parents with different cultural values, speaking different languages, to try and work out complicated conflicts. You just start thinking to yourself, God could have made all of this much easier, but he didn't. As a matter of fact, I think he made it challenging on purpose. Go back to verse 46 of chapter 2 and read what it says. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. So what's the response that these first followers of God have to all of this? All of this inconvenience, all of this tension probably? Well, let's be together as much as possible. And despite all of the issues that this created, how did they choose to be when they were together? Well, they chose to be grateful. They chose to be charitable. They chose to be joyful. And as a result, a lot of other people begin joining the disciples. Now, let's say you look at all this and you go, I don't know. This doesn't necessarily, it's not super explicit that God did all this on purpose, that this diverse setting is integral to what God is doing with the gospel message and getting it to the rest of the world. I think you have to keep in mind that the timing of all of this is pretty extraordinary. That Jesus would die and be resurrected at a time where the city is at its most people. First of all, you just have the sheer numbers of people living in Jerusalem, coming to Jerusalem during the time. But then the differences between people who are there as well. All right, so you have to keep that in mind. Beyond that, I mean, keep in mind that God, through the suffering of the Jews, spread who he was throughout the rest of the world. He's already done that once. He dispersed all of the Jews, and as a result, now all people from all over the world know about the God of Abraham. All right, that also was on purpose. That was not happenstance. So the scattering of the Jews already had one purpose. He brings that scattering back to Jerusalem, and we start now to get an idea of God's larger plan of what he's been doing when we go to Acts chapter 7. Starting in verse 54. Now this is Stephen, who has just gotten up. He has just given a blistering, inspiring gospel message in front of the Jewish religious authorities who have hauled him in after he was preaching the word. And he basically rebukes all of the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees, and they have had enough. They are now losing their minds, being insulted and personally offended by what Stephen has said. In verse 54 of chapter 7, it says this: when the members of the Sanhedrin heard this, what Stephen preached, they were furious and gnashed their teeth at him. But Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, looked up to heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Look, he said, I see heaven open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. At this, they covered their ears, and yelling at the top of their voices, they all rushed at him, dragged him out of the city, and began to stone him. Meanwhile, the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. While they were stoning him, Stephen prayed, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. Then he fell on his knees and cried out, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. When he had said this, he fell asleep. And Saul approved of their killing of him. On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him. But Saul began to destroy the church, going from house to house. He dragged off both men and women and put them in prison. Those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. So one of the great preachers of this first church is snatched up by the Jewish authorities, and he has to give a defense for what he's been saying, and instead he just goes ahead and preaches the gospel to them. Now, something of note about Stephen, besides the fact that he's one of the more gifted orators in this first century church, is that he was chosen with 6 other men to be part of a solution to a problem that the church had undergone, or a misunderstanding between some different cultural backgrounds and ethnicities in the church. All right. The church had mistakenly overlooked the needs of some of the Grecian widows in favor of some of the Hebraic widows. So these Grecian widows were being overlooked. And, people are like, hey, this isn't right. We got to fix this. This isn't good. So it seems like it wasn't a deliberate mistake, given how quickly they tried to resolve the situation. But Stephen was one of the 7 men elected to resolve this misunderstanding between 2 different cultures within the church. Now, the immediate narrative following the resolution of this misunderstanding between these Grecian and Hebraic widows is the arrest and execution of Stephen. So this is taking place right after he's chosen to help resolve some of these cultural differences. He gives an unbelievable gospel message and a scathing rebuke to the ruling elites in Jerusalem. Afterwards, he's martyred, as we read, and a general persecution then breaks out against the church in Jerusalem. At that point, it seems like the apostles seem to initiate another diaspora or scattering, but probably it would be better to say that God initiated this scattering. And so all of the Jews and all of the proselyte Gentiles who had been visiting Jerusalem during Passover and Pentecost are now sent home to go back to where they belong because of this persecution that has broken out. All right. This is likely anywhere between 1 and 3 years after Pentecost. So everyone has been staying together for 1 to 3 years. Now, why does all that matter? Well, because of this one sentence in verse 4 of chapter 8. Those who had been scattered, diaspora, preached the word wherever they went. And in this, we see why the setting surrounding the story of hope is so integral to the evangelistic mission that God sets forth. Because the first church was so diverse, they came from all over Europe, all over Eurasia and the Near East. When their suffering begins at the hands of persecution in Jerusalem, then people once again are scattered all over the world, just like the first diaspora that the Jews experienced. And what does this diverse group of people do as they're scattered back to their homelands? Well, they preach the word wherever they go, all the way back to their homes. And as a result, the world would never be the same again. Out of the horror, out of the suffering, and out of the heartbreak, hope lives. You know, it's not easy to live together. I mean, you take one family, just one family living together, there's all sorts of issues. Now you take a bunch of families of diverse backgrounds and put them together, it's not easy. It is hard having so many intrinsic differences created out of culture, ethnicity, language, and history. It's always easier to simply be with people that are just like you. But that was never God's desire, and it was never God's plan. We're opening this series about the setting of hope by making a very straightforward point. God planned for the church to have a lot of different people, a lot of different languages, cultures, and histories, and wanted them, designed it for them to come together under one banner, His Son, setting aside those differences to make that one commonality sovereign between one another, between us. And that commonality of all those differences would become the vehicle for how the world would come to know the story of hope. Without that diversity, the message would never have spread the way that it did. That is how God gets the message to so many different people, is that He creates a diverse church. And that is not happenstance, and that is not insignificant. The setting of the story of hope is very important. What we will learn from the rest of this month is the kind of work and the kind of spirituality such a setting requires from each of us to coexist in this multicultural, multigeneral, very diverse setting. Because it's not just a nice idea. It's not just something to make us feel better, something we can tell other people. It's not mere moonlighting. The story of hope, our diversity, and our commitment to reaching out to all the people, welcoming them into our fellowship, was in the mind of Jesus, even as He gave Himself up for us. And we should not take that lightly, and we should not give it up easily, and we should always be willing to fight for it. It was part of the joy set before Jesus that He was willing to endure such injuries for us so that He could create His bride, the church, in such a diverse way. I pray that we would all be willing to endure any suffering and fight for that dream as well. Let's go ahead and pray for communion right now. Father, we're so grateful for what You have created in us as a people. God, we take for granted one another, and we take for granted the ways that You have created all of us in very unique ways. God, I pray that we could see one another the way that Jesus sees us, as valuable, as integral, as family. God, as we take up our communion right now and we take up the bread that represents Jesus' flesh, we remember His life and the way that He was, the way that He spent time with the poor, the rich, the young, the old, those that were Jews, those that were Samaritans. Father, He was such an example of valuing the differences between people, and yet using those differences towards a common purpose. And God, as we take up the fruit of the vine, we remember what He sacrificed to establish His bride, the church. God, please help us be willing to sacrifice. It is so easy for us to look to our own needs, to put our own values, to put our own desires ahead of the people that are different from us. And help us to be a people that is different. Help us to be the light on the hill so that people can see what it can be like for people to value one another above each other. God, that is the Jesus way. That is why He spilled His blood, was willing to spill His blood, because He loved us more than He loved Himself. Please help us to imitate that sacrifice. God, I love You so much. Thank you for this time, and thank you for this month as we look at the setting of hope and the way that you created such a different environment so that your word could go out. I love you, God. It's in your son's name that I pray. Amen.